If you have ever been underestimated, ignored, or written off by people who thought they were smarter than you, this story is for you. And I promise you, by the end of it, you will understand exactly why this single father became the most dangerous man in a billion-dollar company without anyone realizing it until it was too late. Before we go any further, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by more people who need to hear them. Daniel Reyes was the kind of man nobody noticed. 42 years old, quiet, a little tired around the eyes, the kind of tired that comes from raising a 9-year-old daughter alone after his wife passed away 3 years earlier. He worked in the compliance department of Hardworking Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the country, on the 11th floor, in a cubicle so small his co-workers joked you could touch both walls with your elbows out. He wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. He packed his own lunch. He left at exactly 5:15 every single day because his daughter Ellie had to be picked up from the after-school program by 5:45. And if he was late even once, the coordinator gave him that look, the one that said single fathers were somehow always one mistake away from proving everyone right about them. Nobody at Hardworking Capital thought about Daniel Reyes. Not the executives who swept through the lobby in tailored suits, not the traders who screamed into their phones about numbers most people would never understand, not even his own supervisor, who forgot his name twice in one meeting and called him by the wrong one both times. Daniel didn't correct him. He had learned a long time ago that invisibility was not weakness. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility meant nobody watched what you did in the quiet corners of your job, and in the quiet corners of Daniel's job, something had been bothering him for months. It started small, the way these things always do. A single account reconciliation that did not balance by $14,000. In a company managing billions, $14,000 was less than a rounding error, the kind of discrepancy any reasonable employee would flag, get a shrug in response, and move on from. Daniel flagged it. He got the shrug. But he did not move on, because Daniel Reyes had spent 11 years in compliance, and compliance people develop an instinct, a quiet itch at the back of the skull that says something here is not right, keep looking. So late at night, after Ellie was asleep, after her homework was checked and her lunch was packed for the next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of coffee gone cold, and he kept looking. What he found, over the course of many sleepless nights, was not a $14,000 mistake. It was a $14,000 thread, and when he pulled on it, an entire empire of deception began to unravel in front of him. Shell accounts routing client pension funds through offshore holdings that did not officially exist. Falsified quarterly reports that inflated returns to keep nervous investors calm, while the actual underlying assets were being quietly drained. Retirement funds belonging to teachers, firefighters, and factory workers. Ordinary people who trusted their life savings to a company with a shining glass tower and a reputation built on decades of false confidence. All of it slowly being siphoned into accounts controlled by 3 senior executives whose names Daniel had seen 100 times on internal memos and never once suspected. He sat back in his kitchen chair that night and felt something cold settle into his stomach. This was not $14,000. Based on what he was seeing, the scale of it, the years it had been running, the number of accounts involved, this was well over $1 billion in stolen and misrepresented funds. And Daniel Reyes, a man who ate lunch alone and left work exactly on time to pick up his daughter, was possibly the only person outside that inner circle who had noticed. He did not sleep that night. He sat and watched the numbers on his screen blur together, and he thought about Ellie asleep down the hall, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm the same way it had been since she was 4, and he thought about every teacher who had ever signed her report card, every retired firefighter who might be counting on a pension that no longer existed the way they believed it did, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he could not unsee what he had seen. The next few weeks tested Daniel in ways his quiet, careful life had never prepared him for. He began documenting everything, screenshotting internal reports before they could be altered, downloading transaction logs onto an encrypted drive he kept hidden in Ellie's old diaper bag at the back of his closet. Of all places, because who would ever think to look there? He started noticing things he had never noticed before. A co-worker, who lingered a little too long near his cubicle, an executive assistant who asked him unusually specific questions about his workload, a badge scan log that showed someone accessing his floor after hours on a night he had gone home early. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that twice, and then he stopped telling himself that, because paranoid people do not get quietly reassigned to a windowless office on a different floor with vague explanations about departmental restructuring, and that is exactly what happened to Daniel 3 weeks after he began digging. He almost stopped. He will tell you that honestly if you ever ask him. There was a night, sitting in his car in the parking garage after picking up Ellie, engine off, hands still on the wheel, when he thought about deleting everything, forgetting he had ever seen those numbers, going back to being invisible because invisible was safe, and safe meant he got to keep raising his daughter without looking over his shoulder every time a car idled too long outside their apartment building. He looked in the rearview mirror at Ellie in her booster seat, humming along to a song on the radio, completely unaware that her father was quietly deciding the shape of both their futures in that very moment. And he thought about her growing up in a world where he had known about something like this and said nothing, where he had chosen his own comfort over people he would never meet, who were counting on retirement checks that would never come. He could not live with that version of himself. He turned the key, drove home, made dinner, and after Ellie was asleep, he kept working. There was one afternoon, in the middle of all this, when Ellie came home from school in tears because a classmate had made fun of her second-hand backpack, the one Daniel had bought at a thrift store because money was tight that month, and he refused to touch the little bit of savings set aside for her college fund. He sat with her on the kitchen floor, both of them cross-legged, and told her that some things people mock you for are actually proof you are doing something right, that choosing to save for her future instead of buying the newest backpack was not something to be ashamed of, it was something to be proud of. She hugged him and said she understood, even though she probably only understood a little of it at 9 years old, and Daniel sat there afterward, thinking about how strange it was that he was teaching his daughter to hold her head high over a second-hand backpack, while sitting on evidence that could either save thousands of strangers' futures or destroy his own. It struck him, in that quiet moment, that the lesson was really the same lesson, that dignity was never about what you had, it was about what you refused to compromise, and he could not teach Ellie that lesson with his words if he was not willing to live it with his actions. He knew he could not go to anyone inside Hardworking Capital. The internal channels were compromised. That much was obvious from how quickly his reassignment had happened after he began asking questions. He needed someone outside, someone who could not be quietly reassigned or fired or intimidated into silence, and that meant regulators, and that meant risk of a kind Daniel had never faced in his careful, quiet life. He spent 2 weeks building a case so airtight that no lawyer, no executive, no army of corporate fixers could pick it apart, cross-referencing account numbers, matching falsified reports against the raw underlying data he had managed to preserve, building a timeline that traced the fraud back nearly 6 years. He worked at that kitchen table every single night until his eyes burned, and every single morning he still made Ellie's lunch, still walked her to the bus stop, still smiled, and asked about her day like nothing in his world was quietly catching fire. The night before he made contact with federal investigators, Daniel sat on the edge of Ellie's bed after she had fallen asleep and just watched her breathe for a long moment. He thought about what could happen if this went wrong. Lawsuits, retaliation, maybe worse. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be, not the father who protected his daughter by staying small and silent, but the father who showed her, even if she was too young to understand it yet, that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. He kissed her forehead and quietly closed the door. What followed was the hardest and most frightening stretch of Daniel's life. Meetings in parking lots with investigators who spoke to him in hushed, careful tones. A subpoena that arrived at his apartment disguised as an ordinary envelope, which made his hands shake so badly he had to sit down before opening it. Nights where he was certain a car parked across the street belonged to someone watching him, and nights where nothing happened at all, and the silence somehow felt worse. Hardworking Capital's executives, sensing the walls closing in, launched a quiet campaign to discredit him internally. spreading rumors that he was being investigated for embezzlement himself, a cruel and calculated lie designed to make any evidence he provided look like the desperate deflection of a guilty man. For a brief, terrifying period, Daniel watched his own reputation, the one thing he had built quietly and carefully over 11 years, get dismantled by people with far more power and far fewer scruples than he had ever imagined. But Daniel had something they did not account for: patience, and 11 years of knowing exactly how compliance paperwork worked. Every document he had preserved was authenticated, time-stamped, and cross-verified before he ever handed it over. When federal investigators finally moved, they moved with the full weight of evidence Daniel had spent months assembling in the quiet hours after his daughter fell asleep. The raid on Halbridge Capital's headquarters happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and by that afternoon, financial news channels across the country were running the same story: a scheme that had stolen well over $1 billion from pension funds belonging to tens of thousands of ordinary working people, uncovered not by a rival firm, not by a whistleblower hotline, but by a single compliance analyst working alone at his kitchen table after bedtime stories and spelling homework. Daniel's name did not stay hidden for long after that. Reporters found him within days, camped outside an apartment building that had never seen so much as a delivery truck double park, and suddenly a man who had spent his entire career trying to be invisible found himself impossible to ignore. He was awkward in front of cameras at first, still just a tired single dad blinking into unfamiliar lights, but he answered every question honestly, and something about his plain, unpolished sincerity resonated with people in a way that slicker, more practiced whistleblowers never quite managed. He was not doing this for fame. He clearly did not want it. He kept saying the same thing in every interview, that he just could not look away once he saw what was happening to people's retirements, people who reminded him of his own parents, and that if it had been his money, he would have wanted someone to do the same for him. The fallout for Halbridge Capital was seismic. The 3 executives at the center of the scheme were arrested within the month, facing charges that carried decades of potential prison time. Regulatory bodies froze remaining assets before they could be moved further offshore, and a painstaking recovery process began that would eventually return the majority of the stolen retirement funds to the people it belonged to. Teachers who had spent 30 years in classrooms, firefighters who had run into burning buildings, trusting that their pensions would be there waiting for them. Ordinary families whose entire financial future had nearly been erased by men who saw them as nothing more than numbers to be moved and hidden. Daniel received a whistleblower award through the federal program, more money than he had ever imagined seeing in his lifetime, though he would tell you if you asked him that the number on the check mattered far less than the letters he started receiving afterward, dozens and then hundreds of them, from retirees who had gotten their pensions back, from teachers who could finally stop worrying about their retirement, from strangers who simply wanted to thank the quiet man in the cubicle nobody used to notice. He used part of the award to move into a slightly bigger apartment, one with a proper backyard where Ellie could finally have the dog she had been asking for since she was 6. He kept working, though not at Halbridge Capital, which collapsed under its own scandal within a year. Its glass tower eventually sold off to another firm entirely. Daniel found quieter work at a smaller, more transparent company, the kind of place where nobody would ever need a man like him to notice the numbers that did not add up, though if they ever did, everyone there now knew exactly what he was capable of. What people remember most, though, is not the $1 billion, not the arrests, not the headlines that faded within a few news cycles, the way headlines always do. What people remember is the image that ran alongside nearly every story about him, a candid photograph a neighbor had taken months earlier, long before any of this began, of Daniel walking Ellie to the bus stop in the early morning light, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, both of them laughing at something only the 2 of them understood. That photograph became the quiet symbol of the entire story, a reminder that the most powerful acts of courage rarely come from people chasing power at all. They come from ordinary people simply trying to do right by the ones they love, and in doing so, ending up doing right by thousands of strangers they will never meet. Daniel Reyes never set out to be a hero. He set out to be a good father, to raise his daughter with honesty even when honesty was costly, even when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay safe. And maybe that is the real lesson underneath all of it, that the world rarely changes because of the loudest people in the room. It changes because of the quiet ones who finally decide they have had enough, who sit at kitchen tables long after everyone else has gone to sleep, and who choose against every instinct telling them to look away, to keep looking anyway. If this story moved you even a little, remember that somewhere out there right now, someone just like Daniel is sitting quietly with a decision to make, wondering if doing the right thing is worth the risk. It almost always is.